to extend the 3.4% for 1 year, and we'll address this next year in the Higher Education Act. With that, Mr. President, I'm sorry, Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President,
Senator from Ohio.
thank you, Mr. President. I want to echo the words of my colleague from Iowa about this upcoming vote and its importance. We know a lot about what's happened. Student loan debt now exceeds $1 trillion. That's $1,000 billion. It's more than credit card debt in this country. It's more than auto loans. Student loan debt is second only to mortgage debt, and the debt that the people of this great country of 300 million people face. According to the Wall Street Journal, the average student loan debt for a college graduate who borrowed to finance a bachelor's degree this year is nearly $30,000. My wife, who graduated some years ago from Kent State University, first in her family to go to college, graduated with just $1,200. Her family, her father carried a union card, worked at the local utility company in Ashtabula. Her mother was a home care worker. They had no real money to put into her education or the education of her two younger sisters and younger brother. Yet she graduated with only $1,200 in debt, getting a 4-year degree in Kent State University, going on to a very good career in journalism. For students like a young man named Amish Patel, who works 2 jobs to pay tuition at that same university at Kent State, Stafford loans are so important. Stafford loans are an essential tool in helping students like Amish achieve their goal of obtaining a college degree. Just 7 days ago, because of inaction by Congress we know so well from Senator Harkin and other comments on the floor, Senator Harkins and other comments on the floor, the Stafford interest rate doubled from 3.4% to 6.8%. We have a chance to address the private student loan market today also. My legislation introduced not so long ago helps those students, those 2.9 million students across the country with more than $150 billion in private student loan debt. Overall, student loan debt is $1 trillion. Most of that is with the direct lending program, the Stafford loan program from the federal government. $150 billion, about 15%, burdening about 2.9 million students is private student loan debt. Private loans typically have higher interest rates, sometimes topping 15, 16, 17, 18%. They're more difficult to refinance. They offer fewer payment options than those loans administered by the U.S. Department of Education. Recent graduates with private loans like Lindsay Spratlin of Macedonia, a community in Northeast Ohio, are living with their parents because their heavier debt burden means they're often unable to buy a home, to start a business, to buy a car, to go on to graduate school. So along with Senator Heitkamp, I'm introducing legislation to help stop the fleecing of college graduates who are stuck under a mountain of private student loan debt. So often these banks won't refinance these loans. They're paying much higher interest rates. Sometimes they're co-signed, other times they're not co-signed by a family member, by a parent typically. But either way, they're a huge burden where a significantly lower interest rate would be available if they could refinance these. Senator Heitkamp's and my Refinancing Education Funding to Invest in the Future Act addresses this problem by authorizing the Treasury Department to make the private student loan market more efficient. But I want to read a couple letters, Mr. President, because we know, we come to the floor of the Senate, we talk about statistics. We don't often enough illustrate, even reciting notes and letters and stories and discussions from people whom we meet or people who write our office or when we meet on college campuses or around the country, around our states. This is a letter from Chad, age 25, from Toledo. He's from the University of Toledo. He writes, I'm currently pursuing a bachelor's degree in electrical engineering at the University of Toledo. Chad writes, I live 15 minutes away, so I'm a commuter living at home. My parents don't have the funds to help me pay for college, so in order to attend, I must work full-time to cover expenses. The federal aid I receive helps me cover a good portion of the tuition costs. Increasing the interest rate for my loans would be devastating to me at a financial level. It's hard enough to pay them at the rate they're at now, the 3.4%. He wrote this before it had gone up to 6.8. Increasing them would only make things a lot worse. He writes, Senator Brown, if there's anything you can do to prevent this from happening, please do so. I'm not the only one that will feel the major effects from this. That's why this upcoming vote, Mr. President, is so important. Let me share one other letter from Oregon, Ohio. It's also near Toledo. It's from Lennox. I've been a single mother of twin boys since 1989. They were born October 1st, 1986. I co-signed on loans for both of them so they could further education in the field they love, music. Jason went to Ball State University for 2 years and then transferred to Carnegie Mellon for his BA and obtained his master's degree in art management. Jason is working in New York City for Distinguished Concerts International, but due to the loans he incurred and the cost of living, barely has enough to buy food. He pays $1,300 a month on his loans. Sean received his BA from Carnegie Mellon, then went to the University of Miami 1 year and then transferred back to the University of Cincinnati Music Conservatory and received his master's degree in vocal performance. He works as a singing waiter. He has voice students, but is in the same situation as his brother. His income for 2012 was under $20,000, but he's paying $900 a month on his loans. That's half his income. I work full-time. I've been at the same company 19 years. Their mother writes, make $35,000 a year, have good credit, own my own home, still making payments, and I wanted to refinance. I was told I have too much outstanding debt due on the loans I co-signed for my children. Too much debt to ratio, so I cannot refinance to lower my payments. So it's not only these burdensome student loans with interest rates too high if they double to 6.8%, with costs too high anyway. They not only affect that student, and that student, when she or he graduates and wants to buy a house or start a business, affecting the whole economy, they also affect the burden. The debt burden affects parents when their mother, when Jason and Sean's mother couldn't refinance her own mortgage because of the debt she had because she had co-signed a letter, co-signed student loans for her sons. The American way, she writes, is to help our children. They would not have been able to accomplish their dream of education in the music field if I hadn't co-signed for their educational loans. Mr. President, I think that sums it up. The two letters from the University of Toledo student and from the mother of the twins sums up in so many ways. Those two letters sum up why this issue is so important, why the Senate needs to act, and act quickly, because the interest rates and student loans doubled last week. Mr. President, I note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Senator from Texas.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be rescinded.
Without objection.
Mr. President, it seems that the Majority Leader and some others are rattling the cage once again in favor of the so-called nuclear option. And for those who follow this topic more than others, this is simply breaking the Senate rules in order to impose majority will on the minority party by changing the procedures by which the Senate functions. In other words, it refers to a process by which the rules of the Senate are broken in order to change the rules themselves. As the distinguished Majority Leader has pointed out in the past, he said he would not do this right here on the Senate floor in front of his colleagues and constituents and all the American people. Senator Reid affirmed that the proper way to change the Senate rules was through the procedure laid out in those rules. He went on to say, and this is the Majority Leader, Senator Reid of Nevada, that he would oppose any effort in this Congress or the next to change the Senate rules other than through the regular order. And he recommitted himself to this proposition in a colloquy with the Republican leader earlier this year. So I would like to ask the Majority Leader, do you plan on keeping your word? Or are you going to resort to brute political force and break the Senate rules in order to change the rules and fundamentally transform the nature of the United States Senate? Should the Majority Leader break his promise, I believe he will inflict lasting and perhaps irreparable damage to this institution. And I believe during a time when cooperation is very important, as it always is, to try to actually solve some of the nation's biggest problems, poisoning the well by exercising this so-called nuclear option would be the opposite of what we ought to be doing, which is coming together in a bipartisan way to address some of the nation's biggest challenges. I want to also ask my Democratic colleagues, how do you reconcile your desire for a filibuster-free Senate with the simple fact that Democrats will not always be in the majority in the Senate? As we know, what goes around comes around, and the shoe will always be on the other foot. I can think of a number of legislative proposals that Republicans on this side of the aisle would happily advance with a simple majority. Let's say, for example, a full repeal of Obamacare. That'd be a good place to start. As the senior senator from Tennessee, Senator Alexander, recently pointed out, we could finally establish the Yucca Mountain Nuclear Waste Facility in Nevada. But the truth is that prudence and a healthy respect for the fleeting nature of power in the Senate, as well as a healthy respect for the voices represented by the minority in the United States Senate, I think compels a different course of action. Because, as we know, the shoe will always be on the other foot at some day in the future. So I think it's worth pausing to examine the source of the Majority Leader's renewed interest in the so-called nuclear option. On the heels of the President's recent judicial nominations, many of our friends across the aisle are renewing their wayward cries of Republican obstructionism in the Senate. But the facts simply don't bear this out. The facts do not support this conclusion. Indeed, as the Washington Post fact checker recently pointed out, from nomination to confirmation, President Obama's district court nominees have moved through the Senate at only a marginally slower pace than his predecessors, while his appeals court nominees have sailed through at a much faster clip than President Bush's. The United States Senate has confirmed 28 of the President's judicial nominees so far this year. By this point in President Bush's second term, this body had confirmed only 10, 28 under President Obama, 10 under President Bush at this point in their second term. In total, 199 of President Obama's judicial nominees have been confirmed, and only 2 have been defeated. 199 confirmed, two defeated. That doesn't sound like obstructionism to me. Meanwhile, the President has failed to produce nominees for 65% of the vacant judicial seats, many of which are in my home state in Texas. And as the distinguished presiding officer knows, and as the American people know, it is the President who nominates federal judges, and then it's the responsibility of the United States Senate to advise and consent on those confirmations. That's in the Constitution. But if the President doesn't nominate people for these vacancies, then the Senate's role never is engaged on those 65% of vacant judicial seats where the President has not even nominated an individual to serve. I would argue that that's the true reason for the majority of vacancies and one that calls for the President's immediate attention. So, Mr. President, I hope during the remaining few weeks here in July, before the August recess, we don't see a manufactured crisis over how the Senate operates on nominees. We have some very controversial nominees. For example, 3 of whom who were unconstitutionally recess appointed by the President. And don't take my word for it. That's in the case of the National Labor Relations Bureau. The Court of Appeals held that those were unconstitutionally appointed in order to circumvent the Senate's constitutional role. It is true that the United States Supreme Court has taken those cases, and we will soon hear, perhaps by next summer, what the Supreme Court's view of the recess appointment authority of a president might be. But we know that at least 3 of them, 2 of the National Labor Relations Board and the so-called Consumer Financial Protection Bureau nominee, those were all recess appointed, and I think it's pretty clear in violation of at least the Court of Appeals' view of what the President's constitutional authority would and should be. We also know we have other nominees, some of whom are more controversial than others. We have Gina McCarthy, who's been nominated for the Environmental Protection Agency. We have James Comey, who was this morning before the Senate Judiciary Committee and who I believe will enjoy broad bipartisan support as the next FBI director. We have other more controversial nominees like Thomas Perez to the Department of Labor. That's in part due to his activities as head of the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department, where he was harshly criticized by the Inspector General for politicizing that what should be a non-political position enforcing the civil rights laws of the United States. So we're going to have plenty to talk about and a lot to do. But this should not be used as an excuse by the Majority Leader to break his word when it comes to changing the Senate rules through this nuclear option process. That would be a disservice to the country. It would certainly damage irreparably the United States Senate as a deliberative body. It would poison the well when we need to work together as much as we can to try to get many other important things done, and it would be extremely short-sighted because majorities can be fleeting, and those who are in the majority today will find themselves in the minority in the future, and I think that recognition would caution prudence and temper the political ambitions of the Majority Leader when it comes to jamming through some of these nominees. Mr. President, I would yield the floor and suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Mr. President,
Senator from Missouri.
I'd ask that the quorum call be dispensed with,
Without objection.
and I'd like to speak as if we were in morning business.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I want to talk about the Affordable Care Act. I've long been concerned that this is an act that just simply won't work. I think the premise that the bill was built around is a premise that won't work. I know things like guaranteed issues sound very popular, that you can get health insurance no matter what your health condition is, but the problem with getting insurance after the fact, as one of the potentials, is it discourages getting insurance before the fact. Getting insurance after you're sick is like getting fire insurance after your house is on fire. You could probably get fire insurance after your house was on fire, but it would sure cost a lot more than it would have cost under what we'd see as traditional insurance. So I've always thought that premise was a problem. I've always thought the requirements in the bill that depend heavily on young people who are healthy buying insurance at higher rates than young people have ever looked at before, and remembering that that's probably the biggest uninsured component in the society, because young and healthy people think that they're young and healthy. And you know, Mr. President, the truth is they normally are young and healthy, and they don't need insurance like many members of this body might need insurance, because they just simply don't, and they know it. And frankly, now that the least healthy or least likely to be healthy among us can't pay more than 3 times the most healthy, we've never had that requirement before. That doesn't mean that insurance goes down in cost for unhealthy people as much as it means it goes up in cost for people who are healthy. And I think those young, healthy people will be smart enough to figure out that it's probably not in their best interest, either in their health or their finances, to buy the insurance that they don't need, rather than to have the ability later to buy insurance if it turns out they need it. It's just never made much sense to me, Mr. President. And meanwhile, as we see that happening from insurers to doctors to employers, people are looking at this law and figuring out if this is a place where they still want to focus their energies. I met with a number of doctors this morning who talked about how doctors are selling their private practices to hospitals, and how specialty doctors are not going into specialty medicine because the cost is too high for the reward they might get. I've talked to employer after employer after employer who said, we've done all we could to provide the insurance we've provided, but we can't meet these new benefits and still stay in business. Or even more employers who said, we may not let anybody go who's a full-time employee, but in the future we're going to hire more part-time employees because we don't have to cover those part-time employees under the law. And then, as people are leaving health care behind, they're leaving their obligation to help provide health care behind, they keep getting different messages, Mr. President, from the federal government itself. Not too long ago, the supporters of this act, and I've never been one of them, I'll admit that right up front, but the supporters of this act were saying, we're going to stick with this, we're going to implement it, we're going to stay fully committed to it. But while we were gone last week, the administration announced that, in fact, they did it on a blog posting, which I suppose is a way to announce something that is as consequential as this. It certainly got a lot of attention. But the blog posting said that the insurance reporting rules and penalties would be delayed for another year for employers. So suddenly one of the wheels on this bicycle is gone. The employer who was going to have to provide insurance or pay a penalty now doesn't have to do it, but apparently the individual who was going to have to buy insurance for themselves if it's not provided at work has to. At the same time, the administration announced that the income verification to have taxpayers help pay for a person's insurance would be waived. Now remember, the income verification for any person or family at less than 400% of poverty, which is a pretty big number, it's around $90,000 for a family of 4, you get some taxpayer assistance to pay for your insurance. But now you don't even have to verify your income to get that. You can just say, here's my income, and whatever it is, I'd like to have the taxpayer insurance based on what I believe my level of income would be that I'm willing to tell you about. So suddenly, Mr. President, the money that the government is spending is going to people who are getting taxpayer-paid insurance. There's no penalty for people who don't provide insurance at work as the law requires. And so for a law that I've had problems with all along, I have even more problems now. It's like never mind the employer mandate, never mind the individual income verification to get taxpayer assistance. How could you take those two principles out of that law and expect it to be implemented in a fair way? The new plan apparently is let the government sign as many people up as they can for government-assisted insurance. Now, I understand why that might be the most popular aspect of this bill. One of the great principles of society and people is when somebody is giving you something, you're usually more glad to get it than you are when somebody is taking something away from you. But in this case, you're taking money from taxpayers to give to individuals, to pay for their insurance, and not fulfilling the rest of the commitments of the bill. The administration obviously believes that paying the bill will make an unpopular piece of legislation more popular. In fact, many of the administration's advocates are talking about how politically smart it is to put off the implementation of this bill for employer-based insurance till after the next election. You can't hardly find a story about this without talking about how shrewd it is that we're putting this off until people have voted one more time before they really find out what's in it. You know, there were no real rules that came out until after the 2012 election. And then suddenly, after the 2012 election, between then and the end of the year, there are 20,000 pages of rules. Rules that nobody saw before Election Day, but suddenly the 20,000 page of rules, 7.5 feet high, 7.5 feet of rules that will be challenging to comply with, but more importantly, nobody saw them before the 2012 election. Now nobody has to have a penalty as an employer until after the 2014 election. I think I'm beginning to see a pattern develop here, Mr. President, and the pattern is when people find out what's in this law, they're not going to like it. If it was believed that they were going to like it, I think we'd be rushing to implement the law before the 2014 election, not after. I think we'd have been rushing to have the 20,000 pages of regulations out before the 2012 election, not after. They had 3 years to get the regulations out before the 2012 election, 3 years. But they all come out after November. And now we're told, well, we just really don't have time to implement this. It's been 3.5 years since the bill was signed into law. If this is ever going to work, how much time is it going to take to implement it? This is a determined effort to get further and further down what I think may be the wrong road before people know what's happened to their insurance, before people know what's happened to their doctor, before people know what's happened to their health care, and when they find out, Mr. President, I think they're not going to like it. Since the passage of the bill, the law has had 8 interim final rules, 3 final rules, 20 requests for comment, 21 proposed rules, according to the Wall Street Journal, 1 information collection request, 2 amendments to the final rules, 6 requests for information, 1 frequently asked questions document. The administration announced about a year ago that the long-term care provisions of the bill, the so-called Class Act, just simply wouldn't work. I remember when this was before the committee in the House of Representatives, when it was said, well, look, there's no way this can possibly work, but the advocates said, oh, no, this is actually going to make money. But once the bill's signed into law and is out there about a year, the Department of Health and Human Services says, you know, this long-term care thing won't work. So even though it's in the law, we're not going to implement it. Then a few months ago, they announced we won't have the small business exchange available in January of 2015. It'll be at least another year for that. And the very same week that they said we're not going to have income verification, we're not going to have the employer mandate, there's another 606 or so pages of new rules and regulations. The rules and regulations seem to come out, but nobody seems to want to implement the law. 3.5 years to get ready. Now, can't get ready until after the next election. If employers should have a delay, so should individuals and so should families. In fact, Mr. President, I think what we should have is a permanent delay while we look for a plan that really works, that can be implemented, that makes sense, that's based on good health care and good health care decision-making. And I hope this Senate and this Congress and this administration will try to find a plan that works instead of constantly saying, you know, we're really not ready to make this plan that's been out there for 3.5 years now work and to work to meet the needs of the American people. And I would notice the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Mr. President.
Senator from Mississippi.
Mr. President, I ask that the quorum call be lifted.
Without objection.
Thank you, sir. Last week, I led a bicameral delegation that visited the Syrian border with Turkey. What we witnessed on the ground highlighted the critical nature of events and the desperate need for American leadership and eventually a negotiated resolution to the Syrian civil war. This civil war is now in its 29th month. More than 100,000 people have been killed, including at least 36,000 civilians, and some 1.7 million people have been forced from their homes, fleeing for their lives as the chaos escalates. To describe this conflict as anything less than a regional disaster is to ignore the magnitude of its impact. According to the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, the violence has pushed over 400,000 refugees to Turkey, almost 500,000 refugees to Jordan, 160,000 to Iraq, 587,000 to Lebanon, and 88,000 refugees to Egypt. A stunning development. The people of Turkey and Jordan, including Prime Minister Erdogan and King Abdullah, should be specifically applauded for their generous support of these refugees. I would also point out that there are now secure locations inside Syria where refugees can be housed within their own country. There is noted international support to prevent the spillover of violence. At the request of the Turkish government and in fulfillment of our NATO obligations, the U.S. Patriot missile batteries at Gaziantep are one example of efforts to deter the threat of ballistic missiles beyond the Syrian border. Additionally, the Dutch and Germans have deployed batteries to Turkey. American troops are working diligently to strengthen our regional security and protect the innocent lives in harm's way. Our delegation was able to meet and visit with troops in Gaziantep last week. These highly educated and motivated men and women are proudly serving American interests, and I commend them for their dedication to a critical mission. Turkey must have the support it needs to defend its population and territory from the raging civil war next door. Without robust cooperation among NATO allies, the stability of our entire region is at risk. During our visit to a refugee camp at the town of Kilis near the Syrian-Turkish border, roughly 40 miles from Gaziantep, we saw firsthand the dire situation facing the countries that have accepted Syrian refugees and the challenges these individuals now face. At the refugee camp, our delegation met with a women's group, children in school, and with the elected camp council. Our conversations were insightful and heartbreaking. Over and over again, the same question emerged. Why aren't the Americans helping to bring down Assad? Why are the nations of the world allowing the slaughter of innocent people to continue? Is there no outrage over the displacement of more than 1.5 million people from their homes? Frankly, Mr. President, these questions are very difficult to answer. So far, the Obama administration has been reluctant to help, in contrast to the aggressive military and humanitarian aid provided by some of our NATO allies, such as Britain, France, and Turkey. I want to emphasize, no one is asking for American boots on the ground. No one is asking President Obama to put troops in Syria. America is understandably war-weary from Iraq and Afghanistan, but our hesitation to provide adequate arms to the anti-Assad rebels is hard to justify. especially when multiple red lines have been crossed. Those who share President Obama's reluctance to assist opposition forces point to the uncertainty surrounding those who might assume control of Syria if the rebels win. Which faction will emerge, they ask? The more moderate rebels under the Free Syrian Army or a radical Islamist band of opposition rebels? While caution is definitely called for in this dangerous and volatile situation, our reluctance to act reminds me of Shakespeare's Hamlet, who once observed that men rather bear those ills we have than fly to others that we know not of. I would remind members and the administration that Hamlet's hand-wringing and indecision ultimately led to his demise. In bowing to a fear of uncertainty and choosing disengagement, the implication is essentially that the world is somehow better off with a known quantity, even a known quantity in the person of Bashar al-Assad. Mr. President, I disagree. Here are a few facts we know about the ills we have regarding the Syrian dictator known as Bashar al-Assad. Number one, he is supported by the extreme Islamist regime in Iran, with a supply of Iranian Revolutionary Guards to embolden his rampage. Secondly, his grip on power has been serviced by Syria's client-state relationship with Russia, which continues to defend its military aid to him. President Vladimir Putin refused to join other nations at last month's G8 summit in explicitly calling for an end to the Assad regime. Number three, Assad has tolerated, if not overseen, the killing of at least 36,000 civilians in his own country. And this is according to numbers from the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights. More than 3,000 of these have been women. More than 5,000 were under the age of 16. Number four, under Bashar al-Assad's rule, the number of refugees has topped 1.7 million, with thousands more seeking safety every day. Number five, Bashar al-Assad has targeted the villages of his enemies in a merciless attempt to eradicate any who oppose him. Number six, following in his father's ruthless footsteps, he has shown that he is willing to use every tool at his disposal to hang on to power. That includes the use of chemical weapons, a development President Obama once called a red line, as well as rocket attacks on his own people. And seven, we have every reason to conclude that Bashar al-Assad is a calculating strategist and student of history who has learned from what he views as the mistakes of Iraq's Saddam Hussein or Libya's Muammar Gaddafi. Mr. President, with Russian and Iranian assistance and arms, Assad has succeeded in stopping the momentum of the rebels. But with sufficient military support, the pendulum can, in fact, swing back toward the rebels. I strongly disagree with those who suggest that the opposition rebels could somehow turn out to be worse than the nightmare that has unfolded. Increasing America's assistance to Syrian rebels, short of boots on the ground, must be decisive and strategic in order to be effective. That does not mean we send arms freely to all rebels. I challenge the notion that in sending military aid we forfeit the authority to choose which rebel leaders to support. I would also point out to members that both the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Martin Dempsey, and former Defense Secretary Leon Panetta have testified before the Senate Armed Services Committee that within the administration, they argued in favor of arming the rebels. General Salim Idris, Chief of Staff of the U.S.-backed Supreme Military Council, has emerged as anything but a radical Islamist in presiding over the armed opposition and serving as a conduit for military aid. A New York Times profile described him as soft-spoken and humble compared to many military men. He defected from the Syrian military after an attack on his village last year, the same village where he and his 8 siblings were raised by a grain farmer. In a recent letter to the United Nations Security Council, General Idris's pleas for the Syrian people were clear and simple. Quote, Syria should not be allowed to become the Rwanda of the 21st century. Mr. President, as I emphasized when speaking with Syrian refugees at the camp in Kilis, a negotiated settlement will ultimately require reconciliation by representatives of all factions of the Syrian society, Alawites, Sunni, Shia, Christians. They must be prepared to negotiate with and eventually forgive their fellow Syrians who have made war against them. But I do not believe that can happen as long as Assad and his Russian and Iranian backers see the momentum going their way. Russia will never agree to back a meaningful peace negotiation if the Russian leadership think Assad can win outright. A leading from behind strategy will not expedite the overthrow of the Assad regime. There is still an urgent need for American leadership. There is no peaceful future for the Syrian people if Assad remains in power. Only one of more violence, oppression, and regional instability. Should he prevail, the impact could have drastic implications on America's national security interests, including the prospect of increased sectarian violence in the region, the rise of al-Qaeda-affiliated groups in Syria, and the expansion of Iran's extremist influence. The United States must not shy away from our potential to make a meaningful difference. Our nation led an international coalition to act in Bosnia and Kosovo, and we did so with success. We did not do so, regrettably, in Rwanda, a mistake President Clinton has called his greatest regret. I do not suggest that one visit to a refugee camp is by any means a comprehensive assessment of U.S. foreign policy in Syria. Military assistance would be fraught with difficulties, and it produces a host of conflicting viewpoints among people for whom I have great respect. But my visit to the refugee camps does have a profound effect, and my observations of what is happening on the ground certainly bring home the enormity of human suffering and devastation that this conflict has caused. Most of those unfairly caught in the crossfire just want to get on with their lives and protect their families. Instead, they've been forced from their homes and from their livelihoods, their entire way of life ripped apart by the bloodshed that no human should endure. Mr. President, I invite the American press to visit Gaziantep and the refugee camps nearby. The American people are entitled to know what is happening to 1.7 million people. After more than 100,000 deaths with so many people left without a home, we should not stand by as the horrors continue to mount. The administration's hesitation leaves the fate of Syria's war-torn people to a regime willing to kill and destroy to stay in power. In summary, Mr. President, we know too much about Bashar al-Assad to maintain the status quo. Backed by Russia and Iran, he has overseen the massacre of innocent lives, boldly crossed red lines, and violently suppressed any who challenge him. To suggest we cannot do any better, that Assad is somehow more acceptable than the opposition forces, falls short of taking an honest, realistic look at what is happening. The question now is not whether America puts boots on the ground. We should not and will not do that. The question is whether the administration will strengthen the capabilities of Assad's adversaries. The question is whether the administration will trade its reluctance for resolve and, like that of our NATO allies, respond with robust military aid. So far, efforts in Geneva have failed to bring about a consensus among major world powers that outlines a lasting political transition. Without changing the momentum back to the rebels, the current situation will not change, and the threat to regional stability and to American interests will continue. Thank you, Mr. President, and I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Maryland.
Mr. President, on July 1st, interest rates on subsidized Stanford loans rose from 3.4% to 6.8%. This means for students across the country, the annual cost of their student loans will go up by as much as $1,000 a year. Mr. President, this makes no sense. The cost to the government is not 6.8%. In other words, the government will be making money on the student loans. That was never our intent, and that makes absolutely no sense. I hear many of my colleagues talk about how we don't want to increase tax burdens on American families. Now we're taking our most vulnerable students who need affordable higher education and telling them that they're going to have to pay more money for their student loans, and by the way, the government's going to make money off of that. Mr. President, we got to do something about that. Let me just talk a little bit about the size of student loans today. Total student debt passed the $1 trillion mark last year. There's more debt in student loans than there is in credit cards in America. 60% of the students must borrow money in order to afford a college education. 35% of Americans, 35 million students, are behind in their loan payments. This is an enormous problem. And on July 1st, it became a more difficult burden for American families because of the higher interest rates. Senator Harkin is absolutely correct, the chairman of the Education Committee, that we should take up a revision of how we charge students for loans and availability of loans and the cost of education when we take up the Higher Education Act reauthorization. And that committee will be taking it up shortly. But in the meantime, we should take action to prevent the increase in this student loans from going forward. That's why I'm a co-sponsor and urge my colleagues to support S. 1238, the Keep Student Loan Affordable Act of 2013. That act is pretty simple, Mr. President. It just says that we are going to extend the 3.4% for another year. In other words, government won't make that money on the backs of our students. And I would hope all of us would agree that we need to get that done now so the increased burden, increased cost, and the unnecessary costs to students are avoided. Now, Mr. President, because of our budget scoring rules, S. 1238 needed to be paid for, and it is fully paid for. In other words, because current law would allow interest rates on subsidized loans to go up to 6.8%, to take it back to 3.4%, the budget scorekeepers say we have to pay the cost of that difference, even though the government would be making money at the 6.8%. So S. 1238 is fully paid for. We take a provision that the Senate Finance Committee has been looking at, known as the stretch IRAs, that basically deal with inherited individual retirement accounts, and we require that those funds be taxed in a more timely way than they are today. a non-controversial provision. It provides the money. I must tell you, Mr. President, I don't necessarily agree that the 3.4% continuation shouldn't be baseline. Why do I say that? I hear so many of my colleagues talk that when we have a tax bill and we extend tax relief, that if we don't extend that tax relief, that that's raising taxes for individuals. In other words, what they're saying, that the temporary tax relief is really baseline. And if we don't extend that, we're increasing taxes. While here, for students, the 3.4% was the law. Why not just extending that? We all of a sudden have to come up with a different standard on how we pay for it. That being said, S 1238 is fully paid for. What I think is wrong is for us to allow interest rates to go up where the government's making money on the backs of our students. We shouldn't be doing that. Higher education is already too expensive, and we should be looking at ways to make college education more affordable for American families. For generation after generation, we've been telling our children that the American dream is achievable to those individuals willing to pursue an education and work hard. And we now prepare to tell millions of students that we're pushing the American dream beyond their grasp. Let me just give you one example. Amanda McIntosh wrote me a letter. First-generation college student, holds a college degree from Christopher Newport University, Columbia University, a master's degree, and Johns Hopkins University, a graduate certificate. Amanda is not from a wealthy family, so she has over $100,000 in student loan debt. Amanda would like to earn her doctoral degree so that she can conduct research that influences policies regarding access to higher education for historically underrepresented populations. But she is burdened under student loans and unable to continue her education, unable to afford a car or make a down payment on a home or otherwise invest in the economy. She simply cannot afford to take on more loans. What is the message here? What are we telling the future generations of Americans? We're saying you need education in order to succeed. You need education so that we can have a competitive workforce. And then we tell them that the cost of education is out of their reach. And now we're going to tell them the loans are going to be more expensive. In Amanda's case, she would like to do something with her future that could be extremely helpful to our country and to herself. She may not be able to do that because of the cost of higher education. And then so many students graduate with such large debt today that they have to look at paying off their debt. It affects their career choice. These might be gifted scientists who could really do something to help discover the answer to dread diseases, how we could cure them. But instead, they have to opt out for a short-term career decision to pay off their student loans. We need to have a policy that makes higher education more affordable, not more costly. And yet, increasing the cost of the Stackford loans from 3.4% to 6.8% will make it more expensive for families to be able to afford a college education. Obtaining a college degree is not a luxury, it's an economic imperative. Affordable access to higher education means more scientists, doctors, nurses, engineers, computer programmers, and other highly skilled workers our economy will need to fill the high-tech jobs of the future. A well-educated, highly skilled workforce is vital to sustain our national security and prosperity in the globalized 21st century job market. So I urge my colleagues to support S 1238, the Keep Student Loan Affordable Act of 2013, as a common-sense approach to protecting students at no additional cost to the taxpayer. As I said earlier, this bill would simply allow the 3.4% to remain in effect until our committee has the time to pass the reauthorization of the Higher Education Act, and they can then take into consideration not just the availability and cost of student loans, but the cost of higher education, the transparency in the cost of higher education, the concerns we have about different types of schools and whether we're getting value for the dollar. All that can be done as we reauthorize the Higher Education Act. But in the meantime, we should keep the loan cost to students at 3.4% and not allow it to increase as it did on July 1st. We'll have that opportunity to do that, I understand, tomorrow in the bill on the floor. I would urge my colleagues to support that effort. And, Mr. President, on a personal note, let me just point out that a very valuable member of my staff, Jody Schwartz, will be leaving us at the end of this week. She's my education person in my office who has been so helpful to me, not just on the student loan issue, but on all educational issues, affordability of education, the quality of education, the opportunity for everyone to have the great dream of America. She's been a very, very valuable asset to our staff, and I will certainly miss her in my Senate.